Who are here. Does this look right? Thank you all for your support. There's so many of you who provided me with so much support, from talking about my thesis ideas to experimental design and interview work, or to even hosting me in your house. And so I'm really thankful to you all. And I want to do a small, so the title of my thesis is How to Grow a Peach: Knowledge Diffusion of Organic Orchard Management Practices in the Hood River Valley. And I want to do a brief introduction, even though Kathleen did a great job. My name is Alma Gaeta. I am an organic orchardist. I'm a first-generation Chicana, and my parents are from Zacatecas, Mexico. My grandfather's a farmer, and so were many generations before him. And I am working and stewarding the traditional and contemporary lands of Wasco, Wishrum, and Chinook, also known as Hood River. And a big part of why I'm introducing myself is because positionality is really important in the discussion that I have throughout my work. And I think in academia in general, because our perspectives and our worldviews are culturally based. They're influenced by race, social class, and gender. And oftentimes there's an assumption that we're conforming to a dominant narrative, especially within agriculture and academia, which is oftentimes white, middle, upper class, male. So rather than spend a lot of time arguing about that, I just decided to present that within my work and have it be incorporated throughout my work. The main questions that center the thesis started with: do different organic mulches affect soil quality, to different extents in an organic peach orchard? So if you look at the picture on the left side, you can see a strip of herbicided soil that has been sprayed with chemical sprays. And if you look on the right side is my organic orchard that hasn't been sprayed, and that's growing tons of weeds. So I started to wonder, oh, how do I manage these weeds so I get proper nutrient management, but also have the ability to irrigate the orchard? So I started wondering that, and decided to do a mulch experiment in the orchard and look at the literature review. And I found that it wasn't really necessarily enough to look just at the literature review. So I started thinking what other orchardists were doing in the region. And that kind of brought me to the second part of the thesis, which: how do orchardists, organic orchardists, obtain knowledge for setting organic management systems? Where does their information come from? Are they reading the literature as well? Or are they looking at YouTube? Or, just where is this coming from, and what resources can we support so that there's more access to that information? So an overview of what I'll be presenting is I'll be briefly discussing the narrative approach that I took. And then I'll discuss the orchard mulch study and show some of my results. And I'll talk about interviews that I did with organic orchardists and themes. And then I'll end with discussing the applied work and how I've continued to work with this information, and how the relationships that I build continue outside of this work that I do. So the narrative approach is divided into 4 seasons, the 4 natural growing seasons. And within that work, there are 3 codes, or 3 strands, like think of it like a braid, that kind of get woven together throughout the seasons. And the first strand or code is positionality. So talking about how research and thinking are culturally based. The second strand is practice. So it's also a practical guide of how to actually grow a peach. So there's information on how to prune your trees, disease, and harvest information as well. And so that's the division into the 4 seasons. And then the final strand is philosophy. So discussing the research paradigm, theoretical approach, cultural perspective, and native science. So incorporating the circle mentality, metaphors, and pedagogy of place. So we'll start with summer. So summer talks about harvest and using the imagery of abundance and harvest and sweet peaches all around me in the summertime, I also contend with the idea of food justice and who gets access to land and who gets access to this abundance. And especially with regards of BIPOC or people of color not having access to this and having to contend with historical trauma through agriculture and their experience with nature. Then I move into fall and talk about composting, because that was one of the mulches that were applied to the orchard. And I connect that to my interviews. So sort of like composting the information and presenting it in a different new way. And then I go on to winter dormancy and talk about tree physiology there, as well as pruning, and talk about pedagogy of place. So what place teaches us, what the plants teach us, what the metaphors that exist within there, how they connect, and how creativity is really involved in the research and all of the work that we do. And then finally there's spring. So I talk about flowers, I talk about pollination, and then this is the section where I also talk about soil health and go into the different nutrients that are required within the soil and within the trees for a healthy crop. So the orchard mulch study consisted of randomized complete block experimental design. And this design was advised through a person who was a fruit tree specialist within the region through Oregon State Extension Service and has done her PhD work, and John as well. And so there were 4 replicates within the orchard. I chose the 4 rows within the orchard that you can see there that they were the most similar to each other as far as the slope and the amount of trees and even location. And there was a 1 year between samples and the samples were taken at the same time of the year. The 4 different treatments or 3 different treatments were a control, a compost application, a double compost application, and a compost and wood chips application. The last one was originally compost and clover, but the clover didn't germinate, so we had to move on to a different treatment. And the sampling were composite subsamples from 7 cores that were dug at 12 inches deep at each plot. So in this picture, you can see the soil core that I used. So at each of the 16 plots, we had to do 7 cores. And as I was doing that work and applying the mulch in the orchard with the tractor and spreading it, I started to think, this is a lot of work. I wonder if other orchardists are doing this. And if not, why aren't they doing this? And so that brought me to my interviews and to want to reach out and ask other people. But before we move on to interviews, I want to show you some of the results for my data from the soil nutrient panel that I did. And so the one thing that I expected to see the most difference in was in organic matter. So these are 2 different ways of measuring organic matter. One is estimated nitrogen release on the left, and then organic matter percentage. So you can see in both, from the global perspective, there was an increase in organic matter after the treatment, but I decided to look at them as well per each of the individual treatments. So when I looked at the means or looked at the box plots and looked at the means of the different treatments, I saw that before it did not have significant differences between the means, and I ran an ANOVA, tested for normality of the data. And then after, there was also no significant difference between the means, even though there was an overall increase in the organic matter, which was kind of surprising. I ran 17 different ANOVAs for the different soil health measures that there were, and there were only 2 measures that had significant differences between the means. The first one was potassium, and you can see here there was a global increase in potassium. And here in the green is the recommended level of potassium, or the moderate level of potassium for an orchard. And the before had no significant difference between the means, but the after treatment, there were significant differences between the control and the double compost and the control and the compost. So the compost had a significant increase in mean of the potassium in this case. And potassium is responsible for fruit coloration. It is also protective for trees to prevent them from getting frost damage. And oftentimes it's recommended that orchardists amend and add potassium each season. The second measure that had significant differences was sodium, even though there wasn't an obvious global change in the sodium levels. When I ran an ANOVA for sodium, there were significant differences in the after the treatment. There were no significant difference in mean before treatment, but after there were differences between control and double compost, as well as compost and mulch and double compost. And I also highlighted here the recommended sodium levels for most gardens or growing soils. So one thing that I noted, even though the literature review showed that compost could potentially be used as a nutrient management system, I noted that the double compost is kind of getting to the level of too much sodium in the soil. So it definitely tells me that I need to monitor the sodium levels as I keep applying more compost or consider other treatments in conjunction with the compost application as well. And so when I went out and asked other orchardists about their management systems, my interest was mainly in learning how they inform themselves and how they develop the knowledge necessary to practice, to take care of an organic orchard. And so some of the themes that came out of that were mostly under sources of information. And a lot of that was in the form of local and farmer knowledge. So asking other people around them and really valuing that feedback from someone who they can see, who's already tried it. And then talking about attitudes towards knowledge sources. And then another important component that was kind of emergent from this work was harassment and farming while femme. And during this interview section discussion, I not only incorporate interviews that I did, but I also incorporate my experience with other farmers in my community. And so I incorporate some of those voices and some of those experiences of having limited access to information or markets because of harassment. And then the final two topics that came up were on sustainability, climate change and finances. And then finally, my applied work has been using some of this information. I'm currently on the board of directors for a nonprofit that works on resilient food systems in our region. So I'm working with them to develop an agricultural needs assessment for our region that's working with OSU and different organizations, working with Rogue Farm Corps and New Fellowship and training the next generation of farmers and building community and building connections that will carry on past this work as well. Thank you. I believe I'm at my time. Is that correct, or like over?
No, you have a couple minutes if you want to wrap up.
Okay, I was going kind of fast. So the Rogue Farm Corps consists of training the next generation of farmers, and they're a nonprofit that hosts internships and apprenticeships. And this was also an influence in like how I decided to write my thesis and why I decided to write it in a narrative approach and have some of those practical components, was so that I could share some of that information with the people that I was training and have that be directly applied. And then the Food Systems Leadership Fellowship is a fellowship that was funded through Eco Trust and some of the organizations that other organizations that you can see there, including the Black Food Sovereignty Coalition, Homegrown. And that's going to be an 18-month long program with other BIPOC food leaders in the region to develop a program like within community and support each other throughout the work. And then finally, I think just seeing some of the results from this study also, helps me adjust my practices and share those practices and continue the conversation with other orchardists of what they're trying, what's working for them, and continuing kind of that networking. And I'm happy to take any questions.